One of the biggest mistakes I see people make in prototyping is messing up interactive components. They're one of the most powerful features in Figma, but they are super easy to break. The good news is that almost every time it's the same issue, and that is what we're going to cover in this lesson. Let's dive in. In order for interactive components to work correctly, the layer names have to be identical across your different states. So in this card here, we have two pretty standard states, default and hover. And on the surface, they look exactly the same. But when we crack open the layer list, we'll see that there's a ton of discrepancies. Because what I've done is overridden all of the layer names in the hover state, but not in the default. And as a result, what's going to happen is this. When I hover over my cards, everything is going to break. And this is about as chaotic as it gets in Figma. Obviously, it's not going to do you any good to have this kind of behavior in your prototypes, especially if you're putting them in front of real users. So, how do we fix this? Well, again, it all comes down to the naming. All I have to do is open this up and match what I have over here, and everything is going to work. So at the parent level, it looks like I have container. I can drill in one level, content. This up here is text. You get the idea. Now, once I get to the point where my layer lists are standardized, I'm ready to go. I can hop back in prototype mode, and as you can see, all of my overrides are preserving. I'm getting that nice icon motion. My images aren't switching, and everything is behaving as I'd expect. Now that was pretty straightforward. All we had was two cards, and it was a few layer name changes, and we were good to go. But what happens if you're dealing with a huge variant set, a ton of different cards, for instance? This is pretty common. And a lot of times you can find yourselves in situations where it's really quite difficult to figure out where the discrepancies are, what is causing these breaking changes, why your icons are changing colors and things like that. These are the situations where I will strongly consider using base components to radically simplify my system. And the reason is base components don't just create a single source of truth for your UI. It's actually giving you a single source of truth for your layer names as well. And that way you don't have to think about overwriting anything in any of your variants. You only worry about changing layer names in that one base component. Now, I don't always use base components, so this is not the solution 100% of the time. I'll be the first to admit that sometimes base components add a level of architecture that might not be necessary. But if I'm dealing with a situation where I think there is a possibility that this variant set would grow to the point where it would be difficult to keep up with all of the different changes and keeping track of what's breaking what, I'll definitely consider using base components. So to wrap up this lesson, I'm going to recreate the setup from the beginning of this lesson from scratch using a base component and showing you how I'll think about strategically naming my layers to set myself up for success in the long run. Okay, so let's start off with my basic card here. I want it to be an auto layout. Right away, I'm going to rename everything by hitting Command R and then typing my name, card. I know not everyone names their layers, but I promise you, if you get in the habit of just hitting Command R and typing the first generic name that comes into your mind, like container, row, button, or just being descriptive, like icon plus button or something like that, it is going to become second nature. You don't have to think about it. It's total muscle memory, and I highly recommend everyone giving it a try. All right, enough of that. Let's keep going. So as I'm building here, you can kind of get a sense for how I structured this in auto layout. All I did was open up the Unsplash, searched pink to match some of the UI, and then I scrolled down here. Now watch what's going to happen to this layer name here, Rectangle 8. As soon as I add the Unsplash image, it's going to take on the name of that file. And the same kind of thing would happen if I would add some text. This is almost always the source of layer name issues. It's because Figma is going to smartly name the layers based off of what that layer actually contains. But what happens is if we don't override these right away, when we do make a change in a different variant, it's going to change the layer name every single time. And that is almost always the source of our issues when it comes to interactive components. So as soon as I add something like an image, I will just hit Command R, image. This will be title. And I'm going to change it to H4. Duplicate, Command R, description, right away. Before I give myself a chance to forget, I'm going to just change it right away. Now, I know that I want some kind of padding on this bottom container, so I will go ahead and set the whole thing to container and add some padding and set that to fill container. Because my card, I'm actually going to set this to a fixed width, like so. Okay. Now I want to change this placeholder text, and watch what happens. When I change this to this is a description, the layer name remains the same, and that's because I've already overridden the default, which is the entire point of doing that right from the beginning. Now I went ahead and skipped a few steps there because you've seen me build a lot of simple cards already. But I wanted to pause right here because this is one of the most important times that you have to make sure to override your layer names. When you're adding an icon, you cannot leave the name of the icon as the layer name. Figma's automatically going to make the name arrow right because that's what I inserted at the component level. But if I'm working in one of my instances later on and I change that to magic, you can see the layer name is going to change. Now instead, what I need to do when I'm creating my base component is override this to just icon. I don't try to get cute with it. Every single instance of an icon in my designs is always just named icon. I'm overriding icons in my buttons all of the time. And so I want to make sure that when I come in here and change this to magic in the future, I'm not going to break this layer name, because if I do, when I move to that hover state in prototype mode, it's going to flash back to this arrow right every single time. Now that I have this card where I want it, I'm actually going to use the Automator plugin to quickly create a new base component that is powering my variants. You can see how fast that happened, and I'll link the JSON in the resources at the end of the lesson. The important thing is that this entire process of creating a new base component that powers two variants, hover and default with the base embedded, took me about 3 seconds, which is pretty nice because you get all of the benefits of using a base component to simplify your layer names without having to go through much extra effort at all. And so if I come in here, I can make a lot of the same overrides to my component. Maybe I want this border to become a little bit more prominent, and then I'll go ahead and do the same button slide here where I'm moving the arrow icon, and that is that. So now if I'm going to do something like add another icon at the top of this card, and maybe I will wrap it in a 0 pixel tall frame so that I can move it up here. Then once I get this where I want it, not only do I not have to do this a bunch of different times for every single instance that I have, but I don't have to worry about making these name overrides every single time. So I've just called this 0 pixel wrapper, icon container, and icon, and that is automatically going to translate everywhere, even if down the road I might want to change this back to an arrow or something like that. Hopefully you can see just how valuable base components can be in this process and how they can save you a ton of time and a lot of headaches. But if there is one thing that you take away from this lesson, if you are having issues with interactive components and things are breaking, crack open that layer list because it is almost always an issue with naming.